federal government is giving First Nations bands until next Friday to post their audited financial statements, which includes salaries of chiefs and of councillors. It is part of the First Nations Financial Transparency Act, and it requires the bands to make that information public. In a letter obtained by CBC News, the Aboriginal Affairs Minister, Bernard Valcourt, says he may punish the holdouts by cutting non-essential programs and services. Does the law go too far? Does it strike the right balance, given that most bands have already submitted their financial information? Two sides of that debate. Joining me from studio is Wudrick. He is the Federal Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and Pam Palmater is an Associate Professor at Ryerson University and a Mi'kmaq lawyer. She's in our Winnipeg studios. Pam Palmater, let me start with you. 49 nations are withholding their financial information. CBC News obtained a letter. A top official at Aboriginal Affairs and Northern Development threatens to withhold their funding for non-essential programs, services, and activities if they don't post their financial documents on the net by December 12th. What's your reaction?
Well, they shouldn't. It's a piece of illegal legislation. There was no legal consultations with each First Nation that would be impacted. It violates the Constitution because their consent is required. It violates the Privacy Act because it's third-party information that's not entitled to be distributed to the Canadian public. And there's no need for it. Every First Nation has to file an audited financial statement with Indian Affairs every year to account for federal funds, and it's 100% accessible by band members either through the band or Indian Affairs. So it's a complete lie to say that this legislation was needed at all.
Just before I get to Aaron Wudrick, I mean, you know, on the other side, over 95% of bands have already complied, and then there have been these cases. And what's your view where you have the chief earning nearly $1 million a year?
There is no chief in Canada ever, in the history of Canada, that has earned $1 million a year off of federal dollars that were transferred to the First Nation. And if there ever was, it would be completely condoned by the federal government because the federal government goes through it.
What's the chief of the Quit-Wetland First Nation who earned $84,000 salary and a bonus of $800,000 stemming from a land deal?
$84,000 from federal funding, which the band has to account for, and separately as an economic development officer through separate proposals having nothing to do with the federal government, whatever he got under his contract. Those are two different things, federal funding and own source revenue.
All right. You hear Pam Palmater say that they're already required to file. What do you make of this? Is this an invasion of privacy?
Well, we don't think so. I mean, the requirements of this act are no more burdensome than the requirements for all federal, provincial, and municipal governments. You know, Professor Palmater has referred to the fact that First Nations were already required to provide this information and that band members already had access to it. But one of the reasons that the Taxpayers Federation began to advocate on this issue is that we were approached by rank-and-file Aboriginal members on reserves who were having difficulty obtaining this information. They were going to the band office, they were being told to come back later, they were being given the runaround, they were being asked questions, they were being, in some cases, being threatened with reprisals. And so one of the reasons we actually be advocating on this is that band members claimed that they did not have access to this information.
Well, and that's not true. I've worked for Justice Canada. I've been a director at Indian Affairs. Any band member from any First Nation can access their audited financial statements either through the band or Indian Affairs. It has always been that way. If there was ever a problem accessing, we need to talk to Indian Affairs and what's the problem with the information flow there. Yeah. But the issue is accountability to the band members, which every chief and council needs to be accountable to. Not the Canadian public, who does not pay their salaries, does not vote in their communities, and has nothing to do with the First Nation communities.
And Professor, that's the reason why when this information is presented to band members, they are the ones that are going to make the decisions. They are the ones that are going to decide whether the level of compensation is appropriate, whether they think there are any issues. We are simply advocating that they deserve the same rights that all other Canadians do with respect to their politicians.
And they've always had it.
That's right.
They've always had it. So this legislation was completely unnecessary, and it's a distraction from what the government really wants. And what the government really wants is access to the personal income and the own source revenue. That's what's at stake here. It has nothing to do with chief salaries. So explain that.
What do you think is behind it, Professor?
The fact that in the legislation it requires them to account for their own personal income in addition to the federal funding and third-party own source revenue. So private corporations that are band owned and operated, making money for the band or other entities that have nothing to do with federal funding. Legally, the federal government is not entitled to that information, nor are Canadians. Yes, you don't see Paul Martin or Stephen Harper posting their own personal wealth when they account for their federal dollars. It's simply a double standard.
The requirements in this act are no more onerous for bands than they are
They're
for federal,
far
provincial,
more
and municipal.
onerous.
They aren't. And frankly, Professor, your assertion that all band members had access to the information, you're essentially saying that the folks that approached the CTF and that approached Aboriginal Affairs are lying that they did not have access to the information.
No,
we disagree.
I'm saying who are the Canadian Taxpayers Federation? You represent less than a fraction of all Canadians. Who are you speaking for?
Well,
this is a right-wing organization
stand
trying to
for,
vilify First Nations who are already living in poverty. What more do you want? Take away their food and water?
Can you
it's disappointing. It's disappointing that you want to allege racism. I think whether you or not you agree with the CTF's principles, we're very consistent in that we demand transparency and accountability from all levels of government, federal, provincial, municipal, and yes, native bands as well. So you may disagree with the nature of the policy, you may disagree or you want to quibble about how far it goes, but to assert that it's a racist position to hold, to say that on-reserve natives deserve the same level of transparency and accountability that all other Canadians do, I think it's frankly disappointing.
It's simply not the taxpayers' business. Taxpayers don't pay for First Nation funding on reserve. They certainly don't do anything about the poverty that leads to our premature deaths every year. So it's really high and mighty to go about talking about accountability.
Right.
You want accountability? Pay for food and water on reserve, and then we'll have a discussion.
Pam Palmater, what do you make of the government's notion that if these bands don't comply, they'll withhold services?
Oh, it's absolutely criminal. Have you ever heard of a modern democratic country threatening any of its people with no food and water if you don't comply with our legislation? The fact of the matter is, whether you agree or not, this legislation is illegal. First Nations have a right to defend their legal rights without the threat of their food and water and housing and education being cut off.
But if it's all right, well, what do you think?
Well,
Mr. Wudrick, if they cutting off, what do you make of the government's threat?
Yeah, sir. It's a big stick to hold. Hopefully, it doesn't happen. We'd hate to see that, and it would be difficult for the government in trying to justify helping rank and file natives that they would be the ones to suffer. But there are two parties to this. It's not as if this was sprung on Aboriginal bands yesterday. This was passed a year and a half ago. 95% of bands have complied with it. To suggest that it's somehow more onerous, as Professor Palmater herself has pointed out, they were already required to submit this information.
The vast majority of bands are not in compliance with the legislation because there's a whole bunch of pieces of the legislation, like posting it on your own personal website for all Canadians to see. Do you know how many Northern First Nations don't even have internet services or websites? They're all not in compliance. So the numbers are skewed. Canada is giving you infactual information to promote their racist agenda that all Indians are crooks and we're the reason to blame for our poverty, when in actual fact it's the theft of land and resources and the chronic underfunding.
It's false to suggest that because we believe that people should post financial information that is racist. It's disappointing that you would suggest that because we may disagree about the level of disclosure.
We don't even have enough money to have websites. No. How the heck are we supposed to online? You just make the presumption that we're like every other Canadian. We don't have the funding.
Pam Palmater, if withholding funding for non-essential programs, services, and activities takes place, what will the response be?
Well, what's non-essential in a First Nation? We have suicides every day, contaminated water. We have a major housing crisis, food insecurity in the north that, Minister Aglukak could care less about. What's non-essential in a First Nation? People are going to die if there is not enough funding for health, for insulin, if there's not enough food for kids or heat in the north right now.
All right, here, we're going to watch this closely. Obviously, it's a very important situation about the Transparency Act and the response to it. Pam Palmater, Wudrick, I appreciate both of you coming on. I hope we have you back to continue to watch the situation very closely. I appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much.
Thanks.